JoJo Siwa has been on what can only be described as a generational run of self-sabotage. Not success, not growth, but cheating on international television, followed by rebrand after rebrand after rebrand, each one somehow managing to lose more of her audience while also finding brand new ways to say the exact wrong thing at the worst possible time. And just when you think the situation can't get any stranger, we get AI-generated children, a JoJo Siwa cruise, and yet another identity reset that's supposed to finally fix everything. So today we're not asking what the new era is. We're asking why none of them ever stick, how someone with a perfectly stable career ended up trapped in constant reinvention, and whether this latest authentic version is actually real. Or just another placeholder until the next reset. Now, before anyone starts screaming that I'm being dramatic, yes, JoJo Siwa will always be rich. She will always be famous. There is basically nothing she could do at this point that would completely destroy her career. Some people have a shelf life. JoJo doesn't. She's a permanent internet figure, for better or worse. But longevity doesn't mean stability, and that's the part people keep missing. Because if you zoom out and actually look at the last few years of her career, you start to notice a pattern that's impossible to ignore. Every time attention dips, something changes. The look changes, the voice changes, the vibe changes, the identity changes. And instead of feeling like growth, it starts feeling like panic. To understand how we even got here, we need to rewind briefly. Not for a full history lesson, just enough context to make the contrast obvious. For most of her early career, JoJo Siwa was the safest brand imaginable. Bright colors, hyper-positive energy, completely child-friendly, not even PG, genuinely E for everyone. And by everyone, I mean children. If you were an adult watching JoJo Siwa content back then, that's on you. That's why the so-called edgy karma era hit people so hard. Not because it was actually edgy, it really wasn't, but because of who it was coming from. Suddenly JoJo was talking about stuff she never would have touched before, swearing, oversharing, pushing shock value in interviews. And on its own, none of that would matter. Every other pop star does worse before breakfast. But for JoJo, it was a complete 180 from the image that had been drilled into the internet for years. And the key issue wasn't the content, it was the way it was framed. She didn't ease into a new phase. She announced it. I'm doing a rebrand now. Everything you knew before doesn't apply anymore. This is the new me. And that's where things started going wrong. Rebrands don't work when you tell people they're happening. They work when people slowly realize something has changed without being told, when it feels natural, when it feels earned. JoJo's didn't feel like that. It felt like flipping a switch and expecting everyone to immediately follow. For a brief moment, the chaos worked. People watched, people talked, clips went viral, but that wasn't loyalty, it was confusion. Once the shock wore off, there was nothing solid underneath. And instead of committing to that new direction long enough for it to settle, everything changed again. And again. And again. That's the real issue here. Not that she changed, but that she never stayed still. You can actually see this panic play out in real time if you watch interviews from that period. She talks about wanting a bangers moment, explicitly referencing Miley Cyrus, wanting that dramatic, career-defining break from her past. But the difference is that Miley let that era breathe. JoJo didn't. Within months, the tone shifted, the confidence disappeared, the edge softened, and suddenly it was clear that the entire phase had been walked back before it even finished. At that point, the audience was already fractured, parents were uncomfortable, older viewers didn't take it seriously, and the people who might have grown with her didn't know which version they were supposed to believe. That's when the next pivot happened. New look, new sound, new posture, new energy, almost like a complete apology for the last version. And while all of this was happening, the internet started to notice something uncomfortable. Every major shift conveniently lined up with visibility, headlines, and monetization. That brings us to Big Brother. The cheating scandal wasn't just messy, it was public, unavoidable, and perfectly timed to dominate the conversation around her. And once again, instead of letting things settle, the narrative shifted immediately into a new relationship, a new storyline, a new arc. Now, to be clear, none of this is about saying JoJo isn't allowed to date who she wants or live her life. That's not the point. The point is how every personal development instantly becomes part of the brand machine. At some point, people stop seeing authenticity. They start seeing strategy. And once that happens, even real moments start to feel performative. This is where the internet's patience really began to wear thin. Because instead of slowing down, things accelerated. More posts, more interviews, more statements, more explanations. And eventually, AI-generated images of her future children. That wasn't disturbing because of the technology. It was disturbing because of the pace. Nothing had time to breathe. Nothing had time to feel real. And then, almost quietly, the name changed. From JoJo to Joelle. For the first time in years, the shift wasn't loud. No dramatic rollout. No massive announcement. Just a subtle attempt to separate the person from the brand that had completely consumed her identity since childhood. On paper, it's the most serious rebrand she's ever attempted. But after years of constant resets, people don't know whether to believe it. Because when everything is a reinvention, authenticity starts to feel like just another phase. What made the situation even stranger is that the moment JoJo's image started softening again, the internet didn't relax. It leaned in harder. Because now people weren't just confused, they were suspicious. That suspicion really crystallized once the Chris Hughes relationship stopped looking like a short-term reality TV fling and started dragging on longer than anyone expected. Not weeks, not a publicity cycle. Months. And to be honest, that surprised me too. I fully expected this to be one of those post-show relationships where two people ride the attention wave, do a couple interviews, and quietly disappear from each other's lives. But instead, they doubled down. More appearances, more interviews, more forced moments of chemistry that felt slightly off. Not fake, just strained. There's something unsettling about watching two people constantly reassure the audience that they're happy. Truly happy. Genuinely happy. Because people who are actually settled don't feel the need to convince anyone. They just exist. And this is where JoJo's situation becomes complicated in a way that most internet commentary completely misses. She doesn't come across as malicious. She doesn't come across as calculated. She comes across as exhausted. Exhausted by a life that started before she was old enough to understand what privacy even was. Exhausted by an audience that feels entitled to commentary on every single identity shift. Exhausted by being frozen in a brand that was designed for children while trying to function as an adult in real time. That's why the Big Brother era felt different. Not cleaner, not healthier, just more exposed. You could see moments where the mask slipped, where she wasn't playing JoJo the brand or JoJo the controversy, but someone who genuinely didn't know how to exist without a camera pointed at her. And that's why the cheating scandal hit so hard. Not because it was shocking, it really wasn't, but because it collided with the identity she had been selling for years. People weren't angry about the act itself. They were angry about the contradiction. For years, JoJo had positioned herself as a symbol within queer spaces. Someone outspoken, someone proud, someone representative. So when that narrative suddenly shifted, not privately, but on international television, the backlash wasn't just about betrayal. It was about disorientation. Supporters didn't know where to stand anymore. And instead of addressing that confusion slowly, everything accelerated again. Interviews became more defensive. Public statements became more philosophical. The language shifted from confidence to justification. And that's never a good sign. Because once you start explaining who you are instead of showing it, people stop listening. This pattern repeats again when you look at how JoJo talks about criticism. She frames herself as someone who's always been a punching bag for the internet. And to be fair, she's not wrong. She's been mocked, infantilized, and overexposed since she was a kid. But the problem is that over time, self-awareness turns into self-defense. At some point, the line between authenticity and performance blurs so much that even sincere moments start sounding rehearsed. And when that happens, the audience disengages emotionally, even if they're still watching. That disengagement becomes obvious once you get into the AI children situation. On paper, it's just a TikTok trend taken too far. Celebrities do weird stuff online all the time. But the reaction wasn't horror because of the images themselves. It was discomfort because of timing. Why now? Why publicly? Why frame something so intimate as content? It felt less like curiosity and more like escalation. Another attempt to stay present in the algorithm. Another reminder that nothing in JoJo's life exists off camera for very long. And that's the point where the audience finally splits. Some people lean into empathy. They see someone who never had a normal developmental arc and is now trying to piece one together in public. Others see manipulation, strategy, a constant monetization of personal identity. Neither group is entirely wrong, because the truth sits uncomfortably in the middle. JoJo is both a victim of early exploitation and a participant in her own overexposure. She didn't choose the system that built her, but she also hasn't stepped away from it, because stepping away would mean silence. And silence is terrifying when attention has been your currency since childhood. That fear becomes even clearer once the Joelle rebrand enters the picture. Unlike previous transformations, this one is quiet. No massive announcement, no aggressive rollout, just a name change and a softer presence online. On the surface, it looks like growth, but growth after years of whiplash feels unstable. People don't know whether to trust it. They've seen too many versions come and go, too many identities discarded as soon as they stop trending. So even when JoJo tries to be normal, genuinely normal, the internet treats it like another performance. And maybe that's the most tragic part of all of this, because if she had slowed down years ago, this version might have landed. It might have felt earned, but now, after constant reinvention, stability itself looks suspicious, which brings us to the point where everything finally collapses into one place: the cruise. Because nothing exposes the tension between authenticity and monetization quite like selling intimacy at scale. The cruise is where everything finally clicks into place, because if there was ever a moment that perfectly summarized JoJo Siwa's entire modern career, it's this one. Not a scandal, not a relationship, not even the AI kids, but a floating, fully monetized experience built around proximity to her as a person. Meet and greets, dance classes, Q and As, exclusive parties, special merch. Once-in-a-lifetime access, all wrapped in pastel branding and emotional language designed to make fans feel chosen. And look, on its own, this isn't unusual. Celebrities sell experiences all the time. Tours, conventions, VIP packages. That's not the issue. The issue is context. Because this cruise doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists at the end of a long chain of identity resets. And when you zoom out, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Every era ends the same way. A transformation happens, the internet reacts and attention spikes, and then something gets sold. Sometimes it's music, sometimes it's merch, sometimes it's access. And now it's a literal vacation built around the idea of closeness. That's where the discomfort comes from. Because when your audience is already emotionally invested, selling intimacy starts to feel less like entertainment and more like extraction. Especially when so much of that audience grew up watching you as a child. It creates this strange, uneasy overlap between nostalgia, loyalty, and obligation. Fans don't just want to support you, they feel like they're supposed to. And JoJo's team knows that. The cruise pricing makes that clear. Once you actually look at the numbers, this isn't some casual family getaway. For a family of 4, you're easily pushing into 5 figures once everything is added up. And yet, it's selling. That alone tells you how powerful the brand still is, which is why this whole situation is so frustrating to watch. Because JoJo doesn't need to do this. She doesn't need constant reinvention. She doesn't need shock cycles. She doesn't need to monetize every emotional beat. She already won. She has name recognition most creators would kill for, financial security, a built-in audience that wants to grow with her. The problem isn't relevance, it's restlessness. The internet doesn't punish her for slowing down. It punishes her for not knowing when to stop. And that's why every rebrand feels weaker than the last. Not because she's running out of ideas, but because she never lets any of them settle. There's no time for attachment, no time for trust, no time for people to emotionally catch up. So when she finally tries to present something quieter, something more grounded, nobody knows whether it's real or just the setup for the next pivot. That's how you end up in the worst possible position for a public figure, where authenticity is questioned not because you're lying, but because you've changed too often. At this point, JoJo Siwa isn't fighting irrelevance. She's fighting disbelief. People don't hate her. They don't even dislike her that much. They just don't know which version they're supposed to care about. And the longer that confusion lasts, the harder it becomes to rebuild anything solid. The irony is that the solution is painfully simple. Stop announcing eras. Stop selling transitions. Stop trying to control the narrative in real time. Let something exist long enough for people to believe it. Because if this Joelle phase is actually real, if it's not a brand move, not a monetization play, not a response to declining attention, then it's the first version of JoJo Siwa in years that might actually last, but only if she lets it. Otherwise, this just becomes another chapter people forget the moment the next one starts. And eventually, even the most loyal audience gets tired of starting over.